Step out of the dull gray world and into a bright, vivid reality where every feeling is stronger and every shade of color seems to tell its own quiet story. Our cinematic visuals are made to bring a higher level of depth and intensity to the stories you enjoy and the characters you follow closely. Click subscribe now and step into a more vivid experience today. Before I begin, let me just check the front-end design skill so I can be sure I produce the best possible output format. I came back home 3 days earlier from a work trip and I did not inform anyone before arriving. I don't do that anymore. My wife Margaret had told me years ago that she actually liked surprises. She said it reminded her of the early days when I used to show up at her door with coffee in my hand and no warning at all. So I kept doing it. I thought it made her happy. I thought it made her smile. What I walked into that Tuesday afternoon did not make either of us smile. I pulled into the driveway of the house I had spent 26 years turning into a home, not just purchasing it, but truly building it with my own effort and hands in many places. That's when I noticed a car parked by the curb that I didn't recognize. A silver Lexus, fairly new model, with Ontario plates. I stayed in my truck for a few seconds, just staring at it. Something in my chest felt wrong, like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and the air feels off before you can even explain why. I went in through the side door, the one leading from the garage. I always use that entrance, old habit from 30 years of working in construction. You don't go through the front when you don't need to. I heard voices before I saw anyone. They were coming from the living room. One voice I recognized instantly. It was my son-in-law's mother, Diane Kershaw. Her voice was sharp, controlled, and carried through the house without effort, the kind of voice that takes control of a room without asking. I never really liked that voice, though I had spent 4 years acting like I didn't notice it for my daughter Sophie's sake. I placed my bag quietly near the garage entrance and moved toward the sound. Margaret was sitting in her usual chair near the window, the one she always used when she read, but she wasn't reading now. She was sitting very still, both hands folded tightly in her lap. Even from a distance, I could see her eyes were red. She had been crying, not just recently, but for a while. Across from her on the sofa were Diane Kershaw and her husband, Frank. On the coffee table between them were several papers, neatly arranged, some with colored tabs marking sections. It looked like the kind of paperwork people bring when they want a signature quickly, before the other person has time to fully think it through. None of them had noticed me yet. Diane was speaking in that calm, almost polite tone people use when they want to sound helpful, even when they are not. Margaret, we've already gone through this. It's just a formality. The bank needs it to approve the loan. You're not losing anything. You're helping Sophie and David get their start in life. Surely you can understand that. My wife didn't respond. She was just staring at the papers. I stepped into the room. Diane looked up first. For a brief moment, something crossed her face. Not guilt exactly, but something close to careful calculation. Then she smiled. Robert, we didn't know you were back. Clearly, I replied. I turned to my wife. Are you okay? Margaret looked at me, and I saw something shift in her expression. Relief, maybe, and something else too. Shame. That part hurt me more than I expected because she had no reason to feel ashamed. I'm fine, she said, but her voice told a different story. My eyes moved to the papers on the table. I didn't touch them. What is this? Frank spoke then, in the way he often did when Diane needed a moment to adjust. He was a large man, retired from finance, and he always spoke like most conversations were slightly beneath him. It's a loan co-signature arrangement. David and Sophie are expanding the business. The bank requires a secondary property guarantee. Given that you're family, we thought it would be simple. A secondary property guarantee, I repeated slowly. Yes, your property would be used as collateral. Standard procedure. I looked at Margaret again. How long have they been here? Almost 2 hours, she said quietly. 2 hours. I thought about that. 2 hours of pressure, explanations, and those papers sitting on the table with colored tabs. 2 hours of my wife sitting there holding everything in while being pushed to sign something she didn't fully trust. I want you to leave, I said. Diane didn't lose her smile. Robert, I understand this is sudden, but if you just let us explain. I understand perfectly, I cut in. You came into my home while I was away and spent 2 hours pressuring my wife to sign documents she does not want to sign. Leave now. Frank stood up slowly, trying to use his height as presence. There's no need for this tone. We are family. You are my daughter's in-laws, I said. That is not the same thing. Gather your papers and leave. There was a long pause. Diane looked at me the way she sometimes looked at people when deciding whether they were worth the effort. Then she started collecting the papers slowly and carefully, as if rushing would be beneath her. Eventually, they left. I sat beside Margaret after the door closed. I asked her to tell me everything. She explained that it had started about 3 weeks earlier. David, my son-in-law, had called her when he knew I would be away at work. He told her their business was struggling and that they had taken on too many jobs too quickly. He said they were facing a financial gap and needed help urgently or they would lose a major contract. He asked if we would consider using our house as collateral. Only temporarily, he said. Margaret told him she needed to speak to me first. That was the correct answer. But then Diane called the next day. Then Frank. Then Sophie, crying and asking her mother not to make things harder. The calls kept coming. The pressure kept building. By the time Diane and Frank arrived at our home with printed documents and colored tabs, Margaret had already been worn down enough to let them in. She regretted it the moment she did. She had not signed anything. That part was important. She had refused to sign, but the emotional weight of those 2 hours had clearly taken a toll on her. I held her hand while she spoke and didn't interrupt. When she finished, I told her she had done nothing wrong, that she had handled it better than most people would, and that I was home now. What I didn't tell her was that my mind was already working on what to do next. That evening, I started making calls. I have a friend named Gordon, a retired real estate lawyer who still takes occasional consulting work. We had played hockey together for years. He is the kind of man who doesn't soften bad news, which is exactly what you want in a lawyer. I called him and explained everything Margaret had told me. He listened carefully. Then he asked a few sharp questions, whether we had received copies, whether any independent legal advice had been mentioned, whether the loan amount was clearly stated. The answer to all of it was no. Gordon went quiet for a moment. Then he told me this was not standard practice. Any legitimate lender requiring property collateral from a third party would insist on independent legal counsel. The absence of that alone was a serious warning sign. He asked me to get him a copy of the papers. I told him I would try. The next morning I called Sophie. I had not slept well, but I was calm. Not the kind of calm that ignores anger, but the kind that controls it. I told her I wanted her to come over alone that afternoon. No David, no in-laws, just her. She arrived at 2. She looked exhausted. The same kind of tired her mother had shown the day before, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying stress for too long. We sat at the kitchen table. I made tea for both of us. I asked her to explain the business. What she told me was not what I expected. The renovation company had already lost its major contract 3 months earlier due to missed deadlines. The financial situation was worse than anyone had admitted. The loan was not to bridge a gap, but to cover accumulated debt. She also mentioned carefully that some of David's financial decisions over the past year had been questionable, and she was still trying to understand them fully herself. When I explained what Gordon had said about the document, her face changed completely. She began crying, not quietly, but suddenly, as if something inside her had finally cracked open. I let her cry. I didn't rush her. When she calmed down, I told her I wasn't angry at her. I believed she had been kept out of the full truth, but I needed honesty from this point forward. She agreed. What followed was a long conversation. She revealed that David's total debt was around $90,000, spread across business and personal credit lines. Frank had been quietly covering parts of it for some time, and now they were trying to consolidate everything into a single secured loan. According to what Gordon and I understood, that loan could have put our home at real risk, not just as a guarantee, but as actual collateral if things went wrong. That meant our house could have been taken. That house was not just property, it was our life. I had built parts of it myself, repaired it, expanded it, and lived every year of those 26 years inside it with my wife. Every wall, every corner held memory. When Sophie left that day, I told her to keep our conversation private for now. She agreed. She looked lighter as she walked out, even though nothing was solved yet. Sometimes just telling the truth removes part of the weight people carry. And as she left, I already knew this situation was far from over. The conversation with Frank and Diane Kershaw took place the next week, and I was not there for it. Patricia was the one who attended. It was not a friendly or casual meeting. Frank reacted by threatening to file a countercomplaint, which Patricia later told me was expected, and not something that worried her much, given the evidence she already had. Diane barely spoke at all during the discussion. By the end of that same month, the official complaint had been submitted. The investigation that followed did not move quickly. These processes rarely do. Still, it did progress. After 4 months, we were informed that the Financial Consumer Agency had determined there were enough grounds to move forward with a formal proceeding. 6 months after that, Frank Kershaw was subject to a civil judgment connected to the arrangement. It was not the first time something like this had come up for him, as we later learned, but it was the first time it had not been quietly settled behind closed doors. The court decision required the complete unwinding of the debt structure he had created around the arrangement, along with a formal statement acknowledging that the document shown to my wife had not accurately represented the real terms of the agreement. He was not sent to prison. I will not pretend otherwise. I had hoped for a different result, and Patricia had as well, and Gordon too when I spoke with him about it. The legal system operates in its own way, and what it reached was enough for a civil outcome, but not enough for criminal charges. That was a disappointment I have learned to accept because I had no other choice. Even so, Frank Kershaw's professional standing in this province was badly damaged and did not recover. The network of contacts he had relied on for these kinds of arrangements was also seriously disrupted. Patricia later told me that after our complaint became part of the public record, 2 other families had come forward with similar experiences. I still think about those families from time to time. I think about how they only stepped forward because we did first. David and Sophie are not together anymore. That did not happen suddenly, or only because of this situation. It had been developing for a long time already. Sophie told me more than once that, although the process was painful, the clarity she gained during those weeks was something she needed. They are both handling things like adults now, each in their own way. I am proud of her for that. My wife still tends her garden along the south fence. Last spring, she added a row of lavender in the back corner, something she had planned for years but kept postponing. I built a new raised bed for her using cedar wood. It only took a weekend. We still live in the same house I spent 26 years turning into a home. Some evenings we sit out on the back deck. I drink coffee, she drinks tea, and we do not talk about any of this. There are moments in life when simply being where you are, in peace, is enough. I am 63 years old. I built my working life with my hands, and in many ways, I built my home the same way. Over the years, I have learned something important. The people who want access to what you have built will rarely present themselves as threats. They will say they are helping you. They will use words like family, responsibility, fairness, or standard. They will arrive with documents, neat folders, and calm, reasonable voices. The difference between real help and someone slowly inserting themselves into your life is not always easy to see at first. By the time it becomes clear, they may already have had hours alone with the person you trust most. That is why I say this plainly. Come home early. That is the advice I give without hesitation. Come home early, ask questions, and do not allow anyone to make you feel as if protecting your own life and your own home is something unreasonable or selfish. I came home early one Tuesday, and I am thankful every day that I did. I have thought about that afternoon many times since then, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of steady understanding that comes only after time passes and things become clear in hindsight. What I eventually understood was simple, even if it took me a while to fully see it. Frank and Diane Kershaw were not acting randomly. They had built a method. It was not dramatic or obvious. It was not the kind of clear villainy people like to imagine in stories. It was quieter than that. It was a slow, careful system designed to find people who cared deeply about someone and then use that care as pressure. They had likely done it before. They would have continued doing it. The only question was whether the people they targeted would be too polite, too exhausted, or too uncertain to stop it in time. Margaret, as it turned out, was none of those things. She sat in that chair for 2 hours and refused to sign anything. I have never fully told her how much that meant to me in words, though I believe she understands. There are kinds of strength that do not announce themselves. They simply hold firm when it matters. What I want to say clearly is this. The outcome of everything that happened was not luck. It was not fate either. It came from a series of decisions made by different people, one after another, each choosing to act rather than stay silent. I called Gordon because I chose not to carry it alone. Sophie told the truth because she chose honesty over protecting a version of life that was already breaking. Patricia filed the complaint because that is her work, and because ignoring it would have meant allowing it to continue. Every one of those choices had consequences. Gordon spent his time and energy on something he did not have to take on. Sophie went through months of painful realization about her marriage. Patricia worked on a case that brought her less benefit than her usual work. None of it was easy for anyone involved, but all of it mattered in the end. We are often taught, sometimes without being told directly, that protecting ourselves is selfish, that setting boundaries makes us difficult, that the right thing to do in a family or in a polite society is to adapt, to accept, to avoid conflict, even when something feels wrong. I no longer believe that is true. Being wise is not the same as simply going along with things. Doing the right thing is not the same as keeping everything calm. The most important action I took through all of this was not hiring someone, or filing paperwork, or confronting anyone in a formal way. It was walking into my home on that Tuesday, seeing what was happening, and calmly saying that I wanted them to leave. That moment did not require preparation or strategy. It did not require a lawyer or a plan. It only required one simple belief, held without doubt, that my home belonged to me, and that my wife's distress was enough reason to act. If there is anything you take from this, let it be this simple idea. You do not need a perfect plan in order to stand up for yourself. You only need the willingness to stand when it matters.